Hybrid war is characterized by the lack of specific time limits. This is the path of provocation, manipulation, and lies. There was no declaration of the war, and clear criteria for the grand finale of the confrontation have not been defined. It is difficult to fight an invisible enemy and determine who the real enemy is. Uncertainty is frightening and easily breaks the will to resist. In March 2014, Ukrainian soldiers were confused and many did not believe that Russia would launch a war against them. Moreover, most Ukrainians did not believe in that the weaker Ukrainian army would be able to stand against the powerful Kremlin war machine. But fear has many eyes. The first year of the war taught Ukrainians not to fear. You are watching the 52nd episode of the program History of the War. In 2014, the Russian Federation committed an act of armed aggression against Ukraine. The war has been already lasting for several years. Every day, we're hot on the trail of the course of the war. We're tracking the links between military operations, diplomacy, politics, and economics. We're trying to understand how the war broke out and the ultimate goals of the Russian side. While heavy weaponry was withdrawn very slowly, it ultimately had a positive effect. The number of strikes has decreased. In January-February 2015, Ukraine lost 10 to 20 soldiers per day. In spring, the average daily losses decreased almost tenfold, but the fighting continued. Russian-backed militants moved forward in every possible way, looking for holes in the Ukrainian defense. On March 16, Alexander Zakharchenko announced plans to seize all the cities where the so-called referendum on the independence of the DPR was held. What was in Putin's head and what the Russian-backed militants thought were one and the same. Russia continued its aggression against Ukraine, demonstratively turning a blind eye to the actions of Russian-backed militants who were allegedly beyond control. The Kremlin continued to supply the latter with weapons and ammunition. It is logical that having a full supply of ammunition, the militants did not spare any shells or fuel, and as soon as night fell, the sky above the slag heaps was shattered with explosions. On April 13, the outskirts of Donetsk became a hotspot in the ATO zone. As a result of a battle between a Sentinel group and the detachment of Russian-backed militants, 2 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. Being seriously wounded, 1 soldier of the 93rd Brigade was captured as a result of a counterattack by Ukrainian soldiers with the support of 2 automatic grenade launchers, an SPG-9, and 2 units of hardware of infantry combat vehicles were destroyed. 22 militants were put out of action. On the same day, the Zenith stronghold in the region of Spartak came under fire. Russian-backed militants used 120mm mortars that had to be removed from the contact line in accordance with the Minsk agreements. One of the mortar shells struck the Ukrainian trench that caused the detonation of the ammunition. As a result of the explosion, 5 Ukrainian soldiers of the Joint Detachment of the Wild Dog Air Forces of Ukraine were killed. The Wild Dog Detachment was formed mainly of volunteer soldiers of the Air Force of Ukraine on September 15, 2014. The aviation equipment and pilots mainly acted as an infantry because the army, which was totally exhausted from battles in the summer, was physically unable to block all the directions. Over the course of 1 year, from September 2014 to September 2015, carrying out periodic rotations, the division held positions at the Zenith stronghold near the Donetsk International Airport. Notably, these forces had the advantage over their enemies. The fact that soldiers of Ukrainian divisions spoke in a Western Ukrainian dialect, which includes some Polish words, created the myth among Russian-backed militants about the presence of Polish special forces on Ukrainian military positions. By periodically speaking Polish on radio transmissions, the Ukrainian soldiers only created this myth especially to in some way demoralize the enemy.
Пан має рацію чи не має?
Having reduced military activity in the Luhansk direction, and despite the agreements that were reached, the Russian-backed militants tried to repel the Ukrainian troops from Donetsk. Despite the withdrawal of artillery, the time of return of the latter forces to their position was calculated in minutes. Any attempt of Ukrainian forces to break through to the west could have been easily avoided. As noted earlier, the further advance of the Russian-backed militants to the west was impossible without reinforcement. Russia could not have openly used its air forces against Ukraine. After all, such a precedent could have quickly led to international isolation of the Russian Federation, a sharp drop in people's incomes, and total bankruptcy of the state. On the other hand, nothing prevented the Kremlin from creating an allegedly local air force. Under the conditions of total domination of Russian propaganda in Donbass, a beautiful story of the emergence of aircraft with DPR identifying marks would have been devised quickly enough. Moreover, Russian journalists had already made relevant reports and made photo shoots on the backdrop of the Luhansk Military Museum. But in order for the airplanes to fly there, the Russians needed a landing strip or at least an imitation of it for international observers. But the ruins of the airport were defended by the Ukrainian armed forces. They did not allow Russian engineer units to start repair work, not to mention putting the aircraft landing strip into operation. So it prevented the Russian forces from the creation of the so-called aviation of the Donetsk People's Republic. In simple terms, the Kremlin couldn't reinforce its occupation forces with aviation because the Donetsk International Airport was destroyed and not controlled by them. That's why the Russian-backed militants persistently tried to repel the Ukrainian troops from Donetsk. On the night of April 15, the forward positions of the Ukrainian troops in Pisky were attacked by a group of Russian-backed militants by using 4 armored vehicles. As a result of the battle, the enemy lost 3 vehicles. 3 Ukrainian soldiers were wounded. In the morning, as a result of direct shelling on the medical unit in Pisky, a soldier of the 93rd Brigade who helped the doctors was killed. Ukrainian military forces managed to hold their positions. War is not only battles, but also diplomacy, where retreat does not always mean defeat. In order to avoid further destruction of the village of Shirokine, the Ukrainian side made a proposal to demilitarize it. The mutual troop withdrawal was proposed by the official representative of Ukraine and ex-president Leonid Kuchma. The document contained the point of the obligatory attendance of OSCE observers in the neutral zone. It should be understood that Shirokine, located in a lowland, has no strategic value without control of the surrounding heights and adjoining Sahanka. None of the armies had enough forces to launch an offensive. Demilitarization in this case made it possible to reduce the degree of confrontation in this area, as well as to avoid the complete destruction of the settlement, which literally became the scene of the street fighting. On April 16, one Ukrainian soldier was wounded in the battles near Pisky, and the next so-called 24th humanitarian convoy arrived on the territory of Ukraine. 123 trucks brought 1,500 tons of various cargoes. According to official statements, the trucks transported food products and construction materials. However, none of the Ukrainian soldiers saw any of these consignments. Hybrid war is the path of provocation, manipulation and lies. If the Kremlin had really desired peace, then Russia would not have sent such humanitarian convoys to Ukraine. Furthermore, in those zones, there would be no militants and terrorists who would have needed a constant supply of food and ammunition, and no war would have broken out. But on April 18, a military truck was blown up by a radio-controlled mine that was installed on a bridge over the Siversky Donetsk River. As a result, 4 soldiers of the 92nd Brigade were killed. On the same day, Russian-backed militants attacked Ukrainian positions in the area of Shirokine by using small arms and 120mm mortars. During the 5-hour battle, 2 militants were killed. A soldier of the Azov regiment, a Georgian volunteer, Georgy Janelidze, was killed in the battle. In 2008, he defended his homeland from the Russian invasion and then was forced to emigrate to Turkey. When Russia attacked Ukraine, he returned to counter the Kremlin aggression against Ukraine and unfortunately was killed in battle. The soldiers did not allow his body to be taken away from the territory of the battle. Thanks to the help of the OSCE mission and officers of the Joint Ceasefire Center, the fire was suspended and the soldiers' remains were evacuated. In the end, the Russian-backed militants stole personal belongings and hardware of the victim and mined the body. Despite the agreements, restrictions and economic sanctions of the OSCE, the Kremlin stubbornly continued to wage its war with constant shelling in different sectors of the front that resulted in the loss of human lives. On April 21, Ukrainian positions in the area of Shirokino were attacked by tanks and mortars. To counter the enemy, Ukrainian troops had to use mortars and larger artillery. As a result of the battle, 3 militants were killed and 1 Ukrainian soldier was injured. On the same day, 2 defenders of the Ukrainian land were killed by enemy fire while they were trying to defend local residents of the village of Pisky with open fire. On April 24, the environs of the Donetsk airport and the Azov area once again became hotspots of the ATO zone. As a result of the fight there, a soldier of 11th Battalion was killed by enemy fire. And in the area of Mariupol, there were more battles, as a result of which 6 militants were captured and another militant was killed. The next day, an artillery of cannons with a caliber of 122 mm, which was supposed to be withdrawn far from the line of fire in accordance with the Minsk agreements, was used by the militants. Then, at 6:20 a.m., the residential areas in the outskirts of Shirokino came under fire. A shell struck and destroyed the wall of a shelter and seriously wounded 2 soldiers of the Donbass Battalion. Despite all the efforts of doctors, Konstantin Maluhin died of blood loss during the evacuation, but Ukrainian soldiers succeeded to hold the front. As compared to the winter of 2015, the spring was relatively calm. The intensity of the fighting decreased and the number of losses considerably fell. Both sides of the armies are starting to equip the second and third lines of defense. Be that as it may, despite the treaty's restrictions and the alleged new rules of the game, unfortunately it seems that the war is never ending. The rules of the game of war, known as international humanitarian law, look good only on paper, but the closer to the front line, the less this code is observed. There is no truth and honor. There is efficiency and only one life which can easily be lost. So there is only one ultimate goal: destroy the enemy first. But unlike in the spring of 2014, in the spring of 2015, Ukrainians engaged in battle without hesitation. The Ukrainian army, the interior ministry units, and volunteers fought the enemy and died in battle, but didn't retreat. Ukrainian soldiers did not fear fighting on a thin line of defense 450 kilometers from Mariupol in the south to the village of Stanitsa Luhanska in the north.